You'll recall our last lecture, we looked at some of the things that developed in the face of an authorized, legalized state religion Christianity. And we looked at the rise of monasticism as a movement, a lay movement, and also the development of the catechumenate, that fancy word for an extended teaching time of initiation and sort of being braced for what you're getting into before being admitted into the church as to try and forestall a sort of cultural easy believism back then. So I didn't get to finish the lecture last time. So far we've covered how many ecumenical councils together? How many have we covered? 2, right? Nicaea and Constantinople, nice. In the year 325 and 381 respectively. We're going to look at 2 more today, actually 4 more, but really we're just going to look at 2. So, and we're going to look at those controversies as they played out, and then also in this period is where we really start to see the church distinguished by region. Even though structurally there remains really just one church, with a few academic footnotes, but generally one church for the first millennium, when the East and the West formally split and there's mutual excommunication, which endures to this day. That has not been patched over yet. I'm still hopeful. I'm not bluffing when I say I still pray for that. I'm still praying for that wound from 1,000 years ago. But even though there's still structurally one church, in terms of lived life and the day-to-day organization on the ground and things, we do start to see sort of both an administrative and a cultural split in this period, and we're going to look at that in detail as well. And the different histories play out very differently, as we'll see. Okay, so picking up with the end of the last lecture, so we're rounding the corner into the 5th century, into the early 400s. So the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople has happened. There's new theological controversy troubling the wider church. So the 4th century, right, in the 300s, what we had debated was the Trinity, right? First, the attack on Jesus the Son by the arch-heretic named Arius. Nice. And Arianism and all its struggles in that 4th century. And then this sort of second movement of that questioning about the Holy Spirit. And then we looked last time at that, remember the Cappadocian synthesis? Here's the language that we'll use to describe God. Language which is in itself not adequate, but the least worst we can do to do justice to the divinity of the 3 persons. So in the 4th century, the Trinity was challenged, but that gets pretty much settled. From time to time, there's some challenges to that. Actually, as recently as the 19th century, some sort of German mystics saying, oh, actually, there's no Trinity. It's like, but, that's kind of a fringe movement. So it gets pretty much settled. But following Constantinople, so the language gets settled of 3 hypostases, and that becomes the norm. As we round into the 5th century, the questioning moves from how do these 3 things, how are they God, to, okay, we'll grant that this logos of God, the second person, the second hypostases, we'll grant that he's God. So there's this man, Jesus, so he's fully God, okay, and he's a man, okay, and then that's where the rubber meets the road there is what prompts the theological thinking of the 5th century. How is the man Jesus, the guy who walked around Galilee and Jerusalem, who did miracles, who taught, who died, that guy, how is he fully God and fully man? Becomes the question that preoccupies the 5th century. How does that work out with his being human? Because you see, we're in logical trouble again, right? Same with the Trinity. It's like 1 + 1 + 1 = 1, right? It's not logical. That's why Arius didn't like it. We have the same thing with the person of Jesus himself. He's one person, but he's 2 different things, right? You can see right away where the sort of logical problem comes from. So unlike the 4th century, where we get this guy who kind of rises up giving what is clearly at face value problematic teaching in the face of the received teaching, what we call the Catholic teaching, the rule of faith of the previous centuries, the 5th century is not the same thing. We will see some guys get condemned by councils, but it's different because they weren't trying to cause trouble, really. These debates are more about misstatements and overstatements than they are sort of explicitly trying to oppose the earlier faith. So Arius was actually saying, look, everyone before me got it wrong. the people who end up being wrong in the 5th century weren't trying to do that. So it's a different order of thing. I want to give you a backdrop that's helpful to understand the 5th century. When we look, I put up on a few slides before some lists of the fathers. When we look at the teachers in the early centuries of the church, it's possible to kind of lump them into one of two schools. And like all categories, doesn't hold everybody, and it's not perfectly accurate. But it is true in its generalities. And these two schools are the schools of Antioch, which is still a city in Syria, and Alexandria, still a city in Egypt. So Alexandria and Antioch. And these two schools differed in two different ways. In the language that was their sort of normal way of talking about the incarnation. So when in sermons and letters they wanted to talk about Jesus, if you're in Antioch, there was sort of, I'm trying to think, there's analogies here to sort of university cultures. I bet if you were deeply entrenched in one or two universities, you could tell by the kind of vocabulary someone's using, where they did their training and who they spent their time with, right? Because sort of communities use a common vocabulary. So there was a common vocabulary for the incarnation, and there was also sort of a normal MO for how Scripture should be interpreted. These are two differences which we're going to see come to bear on the 5th century. So just here's a map. So here's Antioch in Syria, the very north. Here's Jerusalem, just for a point of reference. This is obviously the Levant. And here's Alexandria on the western side of the Nile Delta. So we have this sort of, and we can actually look at different fathers, like Athanasius of Alexandria, and John Chrysostom was bishop in Antioch, and Nestorius, who we're going to see was in Antioch. You can kind of place within the sort of spheres of these two influences. So when we look at these two schools, Alexandria and Antioch, they have these differences, and here's how that breaks down. So in Antioch, the way they were accustomed to speaking about Jesus was to talk, they would use the language, the Word became a man. That's like how they just spoke about it, and it's perfectly orthodox language. But they really would then stress the duality of the person of Jesus. They would really say, he is two things, fully God and fully man. And they would really emphasize that sort of two-ness as a sort of custom of how the gospel was presented. When it came to the scriptures in Antioch, they preferred a more literal, practical, moral approach to the scriptures. So if you read John Chrysostom's sermons, he doesn't go more than a paragraph or two without saying, this is what this means you have to do today in your life. Like, very practical. And when reading the stories, it's saying, look, this is history, this is what we learn from it, very concrete. Actually, any of you who are, I would say this, just about all preaching today is much more in line with the Antiochian tradition. This is kind of our bread and butter now. If you have to, in terms of when they dabbled in philosophy, they would dabble in more of Aristotle's philosophy. And when it came to worship language, they were pretty chaste. They wanted to say, they didn't want to say too much in their sort of their hymns and their doxologies and the stuff in the midst of a service. So contrast this with Alexandria. This might not look like a big difference, but when they spoke about Christ, they would say, the Word became flesh, right? Obviously cribbing that phrase from John chapter 1. And when they spoke about Jesus, they would really stress the oneness. They said there was this person, Jesus, and yes, he had two natures, but it's this Jesus. And this idea is that sort of the Word became flesh. It was his divinity, which was his personality, which was really emphasized heavily. You can see how we glanced very briefly at the heresy last time, Apollinarianism, the idea that the Spirit of God inhabited a human body, but not a human soul, and that was condemned as a heresy. But it's not a coincidence that that guy came out of Alexandria. Right? He was taking this and running too far with it. In Alexandria, they preferred a more spiritual and allegorical approach to the scriptures. So they'd read a lesson from the Bible, and when the preacher would preach on it, he would draw these extended allegories of like, okay, and this mountain is a symbol for the struggle for the virtue of patience, and this shrine that was set up is a symbol, like lots of is a symbol for, lots of preaching like that. You can already see that they would enjoy the philosophy of Plato. Right? Remember the great intellectual tradition at Alexandria. Think of Philo of Alexandria. It's amazing how much intellectual roots of a place run deep. I mean, Philo is an Alexandrian in the 1st century as a Jew. And in their worship, they were okay to they were kind of a more is more school. Like, hey, we can praise God, great. Hey, we can praise the angels, let's do that too. Hey, we can, they would just kind of throw on language. So If you go to an Eastern Orthodox liturgy today, it's more Alexandrian in its flavor. So those are the differences. Do you have a picture in your mind of the two differences? So we're going to see how this plays out. So the first misstep in the 5th century when it comes to speaking about Christ, and I say misstep because it ends up getting dubbed a heresy, but it's really just going a bit too far, was from Antioch. So given what we just saw about Antioch, you try and think, if you took this too far, how does that go? What would it look like, do you think, to say too much as an Antiochene? Any idea? What it looked like was this man named Nestorius, who, here's a bit of a biography, but he wanted to really keep the two natures of Christ, and that language would be hammered out in this controversy, so I'm using sort of anachronistic language for this moment. He wanted to keep them separate, and one of the things that troubled him is out of Alexandria, they started to call Mary the Theotokos, which is a Greek word meaning bearer of God. And when that title was given to Mary, one of the things, what they were trying to do with it, it wasn't initially intended as a way of honoring Mary, as portions of the church do abundantly today. It actually was trying to be sort of poetic in honoring Christ, to say, here's a woman, Mary, who gave birth to God, right? And it was what was much more intuitive in a sort of, I think, a 4th and 5th century paradigm is, of course, humans don't give birth to a god. It doesn't happen in nature, right? To call her the God-bearer, or more technically even the God-birther, is to be saying something wild about Jesus Christ, that God, fully God, became a man and was born of a woman, implying, what's born of a woman? Something that's fully man. So we have it's sort of a synecdoche to say Mary is a God-bearer. You can kind of do the math of, well, she bears God, but women bear children, and humans don't bear God, but Jesus is therefore fully man and God, right? It's kind of a complex thing. But in Alexandria, they love that kind of connected complexity. So they used to sing this, they used to say, Mary, Theotokos. And the story said that, and he's like, ooh. He was uncomfortable with that, and what was initially discomfort began with actually preaching against it. And he started to say, don't call Mary Theotokos. She did not give birth to God. She only, and remember this word that gets us in trouble in theology every time. She only, bing, 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 the word only, you should trigger our ears. She only gave birth to the manhood of Jesus Christ. And she's like, well, yeah, at the level of like genetics, like I guess like his genes maybe, but to say only, and it's the only that gets him in trouble. Because the moment he says only, he's then forcing, like, the illogical claims of the Christian faith are already hard enough, right? Like one man with two natures. But what's interesting is when you try and oppose them, it becomes more complicated still. Well, how do two things hold together in one person? If Mary only gave birth to the human part, when did the divine part come in? And then Nestorius is kind of put onto the ropes, and he's like, well, at some later point. And it's like, then he's not fully God, right? And that's called adoptionist Christology, which was rejected very early on in the church. So Nestorius ends up beginning with discomfort and actually putting himself into false statements. And you realize, like, well, it is logically, to human logic, impossible to say that this Jesus is two things, but it's even harder to receive the Christian faith and say otherwise. To try and iron out that wrinkle makes more wrinkles. I'm not a great ironer. I hope you haven't noticed. But you ever do that when you're ironing? You're like, okay, I'm going to get rid of one wrinkle, and I just made two more. That's kind of what we see in Nestorius and happening generally in the 5th century. So Nestorius, and catch out, this actually sounds a little bit like Arianism, but there was when Jesus was not God, is what he's forced to say. That there was this child in the womb of a mother that for a split second or something wasn't fully God. And all of a sudden then, the wonder, the mystery, the logic-baffling fact that the church has just been handing down for 4 centuries now, that heaven and earth have met, and there is a being in which God and humanity are united, that fragile truth is then ripped apart the moment Nestorius starts saying this. So when Nestorius starts really sort of, he kind of launches a campaign, fitting metaphor for the last week, launches a campaign to try and push down calling Mary the Theotokos and advocating his own sort of formulations of theology. And he runs into Cyril of Alexandria. He's the bishop in Alexandria, head of the catechetical school in Alexandria. He then becomes an opponent of Nestorius and says, Nestorius, like, the moment you say this sort of stuff, you're no longer in line with the scriptures. You're no longer in line with all the way the fathers taught before us. Like, you've gone too far. You've misstepped. So Cyril leads the way in teaching otherwise, and actually points out that if you try and create this rift, as Nestorius, he was forced to kind of hammer out his own logic, and he was forced to say, the divine nature of Christ and the human nature, they are morally united in the one person, but they're not really fully connected. And he's actually expressing the same discomfort that Arius had, right? There's something scandalizing to the ancient mind more than ours because we just don't get it in the same way. But they were scandalized at the idea that God and creation would touch, right? God would need it to be kind of far away and not touchable. And so Nestorius is actually acting out of the same instinctive impulse. There's kind of this hullabaloo and back and forth letters and a couple of local councils, and what's needed is another ecumenical council to sort this one out, because all the regions are involved. So we have the Third Ecumenical Council of Ephesus. It's in the year 431, and Nestorianism is explicitly anathematized. They say, even with understanding, Nestorius, you may have been misstepped at first, but now that you've become like a hardcore advocate of your own theology is new, and therefore it's bad, right? According to the history of the church, like, if you invent something new, it can't be what the apostles handed down. And the whole idea is what's been handed down from the time of Jesus himself. So this is the Council of Ephesus. I'm going to clip through some slides because I have another 100 slides to get through today. But you can go back and look at some of these if you're interested. Actually, this council didn't go off very well. So whereas the first, think of the Council of Nicaea, all these wounded heroes coming and sort of being of one mind, and it's just this paragon of Christian decision-making. This was not quite as such. The Alexandrians arrived first, and they said, okay, council convened, what do we believe? Okay, we got it, we anathematized Nestorius, council closed. And then Nestorius' crew arrives. And like, oh, sorry, we already had the council. That didn't go over very well. So they leave dejected, but then what's great is Cyril of Alexandria, he's a real peacemaker. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, and we see those mercifully in the church. John of Antioch, by this point, is representing the Nestorian school. 2 years after Ephesus, they actually write letters to each other and reconcile and say, okay, undo that sort of slipshod council. Here's what we agree on, and we'll call this the agreement of the council. And then everybody signed it. And so even though in the year 431 it wasn't a great moment, this year gets enshrined because it ended up getting patched up towards a good end. John of Antioch is much more moderate than Nestorius. He harbors some of the same hesitations about Alexandrian overabundance, but he doesn't make the same negative statements as Nestorius. So Antioch actually does, John actually does condemn Nestorius' teaching outright. So anti-Nestorianism, led by Cyril of Alexandria, is in the vast majority around the church, but the excommunicated minority continue to this day. If you go to Syria, and I lived in Chicago, there's actually a parish of this group in Chicago, the Assyrian Church of the East. That is the name that's now claimed by the descendants of those who were excommunicated at Ephesus in 431. They still exist. So this is the Nestorian church of today. It's not a large church. I think they number like worldwide like 100,000 or something. It's not enormous, but they do still continue. And the fact that they've endured through all these things in the 20th century has led to sort of reinvestigating. I think if I was teaching this Ollie class 200 years ago, it would have been a more black and white matter. Like, there were these heretics named Nestorians, and they're just wicked, right? Much more simple and black and white. Reappraisal, reinvestigation of the sources of the early church history has concluded that, well, yeah, Arius was just as bad as we thought. Nestorius actually was not quite as bad as, not quite as black as had been painted in the past. And so there's, the Pope and different patriarchs have offered sort of these olive branches to say, look, this may have been a misunderstanding. Can you agree to this statement? And what's interesting is stubbornly, there's still some real resistance. And I think stubbornness is part of what causes the trouble in the first place in the 5th century. But yeah, Brother David.
One of the things there that I was thinking about is that part where Paul talks about, and God's Spirit speaks through our spirit. That duality and that. And so part of it is there is some scriptural basis
Yeah.
for Nestorianism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of what we're running into as we continue to see the separation of denominations. Is this argument about it's scriptural.
Right.
And so our version of scripture is better than your version of scripture.
Right.
As opposed to that's not there.
Right. Right. No, you're exactly right. So this was, in many cases, battles of scripture, and texts were brought out that show that Jesus' human nature and his divine nature are interacting with distinction, right? And you're actually paving the way for what we'll see next, is, like for instance, when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, this is someone saying, who is fully God, according to the received confession, and yet is saying, Father, could this cup pass from me? Like, what's happening there, right? So both sides were claiming to be scriptural, and this is part of it, just to kind of reveal my cards, part of why I live as a Christian within the particular outfit in which I do, is because of realizing that Scripture alone, catch that word alone, only, right, is not great at solving the dispute. Because we can read into it what we want, we can pick out the pieces that we like. And I went to a premier Christian undergraduate college, and I heard like the best arguments, and nobody agreed. And all this stuff, I said, well, if Scripture is our only data, well, then we're just going to live with disagreement. Maybe that's the only way, but then when I learned about church tradition and this concept of sort of what was handed down from the beginning, well, that's the court of arbitration and appeal. For, well, which way is the right way to read Scripture? It's actually less about what an individual intellect can pick out of Colossians or 1 Corinthians, and it's more about, well, what have we received and how does it harmonize with what we're dealing with now? And but I want to jump springboard from what you're saying, David, because so there was this anti-Nestorian zeal. They're like, yeah, Christ isn't two totally separate things. He's one thing. And it's like, okay, just stay in the middle, stay right there. No, right? It leads to overstatement. An intellectual ally of Cyril, so he was an ally of Cyril standing in Alexandria against Nestorius in Antioch, then actually missteps in the exact opposite direction and invents what we now call monophysitism. Mono, there's that dangerous word again, right? Only, from the Greek physis, meaning nature, saying Christ has only one nature, right? So Nestorius over here wants to say there's two natures, they only barely touch in the person of Jesus Christ. There's a moderate Catholic received middle ground, and then in opposing Nestorius, there's this Alexandrian sort of pendulum swing led by a guy named Eutyches. Eutyches taught that when the two natures came together, the divine and the human, they came together and just fully blurred into each other. He uses the phrase, like a drop of water into the ocean. Right? Like in the same way you couldn't distinguish an individual drop from the ocean, his divine and his human nature became one thing. Which sounds actually fairly logically satisfying. Do you see any problems with it? Is there any intuitive problems to that? You're kind of my focus group as to how much 4th century maps onto a 21st century theological grid. So, yeah. Okay, yeah. So I hadn't thought of it going that way, but you're right. The principle there is one gets obliterated. But the way the problem was received at first was to see that kind of clearly God would trump human, and that therefore it would obliterate his true humanity. So if this is true, then we can't call him truly human. He's actually sort of like a Marvel superhero, right? If the natures have just been blurred together, there isn't a real human in there that's actively wrestling out faithfulness and obedience to the Father. And therefore, he's actually not like us in every way, as it says in the letter to the Hebrews, which causes problems for the salvation picture again, if heaven and earth are not fully joined, right? So right away the church actually then has the problem has shifted its centers. First the problem's in Antioch, now the problem is sourced in Alexandria. and we need another ecumenical council. So you're seeing these are coming kind of more rapid fire. 431, 451, that's just 20 years later. So now the fourth one is against Eutyches, right? Actually having to fight the side that won 20 years before. And I actually love that. It shows that the operating corporate mind of the church isn't just about like winning and partisan victories. It's willing to like chasten the previous victors in order to get back to the truth. So Fourth Ecumenical Council, this is the Council of Chalcedon. 600 bishops. This is this is a great council. There's lots of back and forth about exactly which language is the best to use. And believe it or not, it all hinged on a preposition. And actually, to this day, I haven't gotten quite to the bottom of it. But all I know is that some people were saying Christ exists in two natures or of two natures. And they just debated about that for like 4 months, that preposition. I'm on a task force right now that's revising some liturgies in the prayer book. And I know this because I know this from the inside because I was in a meeting one time where we spent an hour and a half talking about where a comma should go for its theological suggestions. So, anyways, Leo, the Bishop of Rome at this point, writes this letter, which has come to be called the Tome of Leo. He sends it to the council because he's not there in person. He'd sent his envoy. And they read the letter, and they're like, boom, that solves everything. So the Council of Chalcedon takes the language of this letter almost verbatim and says, this is the received teaching of the church on the person of Christ. And it's called, and the language says, one person who exists in two natures, that the natures are united like the Alexandrians have been saying when they're no overstep, and yet distinct, just like Antiochans have always said when they don't overstep, right? So it's both. Here again, like the Cappadocians, we're finding language which says everything, and yet at the letter is still just kind of punting to self-defined mysteries, right? Devout followers of Cyril disagree. They think, it's one of those things where you ever hear that adage, you know you're probably okay if both sides don't like you. There was disgruntlement on both sides. The extreme Alexandrians thought this phrase was too Nestorian. The Nestorians thought it was too Alexandrian. And these groups have sort of extended histories. But anyways, the history, so the Council of Chalcedon, I won't read this whole thing, but they come up with what has come down to history as the Chalcedonian definition. And in the same way, it's the Council of Nicaea and Constantinople sort of hammer out once and for all that Jesus is fully God. This is the statement which hammers out once and for all how those two natures exist in Jesus. So the sort of central language is here, that he's, this raw confession, true God and true man. When it comes to his Godhead, he's the same as God. When it comes to manhood, he's the same as man. And so this is just repetitions of the same idea over and over in a way. But then the rub is this. Both natures are preserved. Neither is obliterated. He remains at all times fully human and fully divine. And yet they both exist in one person or one hypostasis. There's that word again, right? But this is called sometimes the hypostatic union, that in one hypostasis is God and man. And then here's the distinction. Not as though he were parted or divided into two persons. Who's that phrase against? Who is saying that Christ is basically kind of like two people? Nestorius, right? But one and the self-same and only begotten God. And then when it says that here, in two natures unconfusedly, who's that coming against? Eutyches, right? Eutyches was confusing the two. So this statement is just what it's doing is just standing in the middle, and it's just saying, nope, not that, not that, not that. And in the middle, even though this is a very verbose statement, it's actually carving out very little positively. Remember we looked about how good theological language last time operates negatively by just saying, look, we know it's not these things. And the real thing is this sort of ineffable thing we just hold in the middle. You can trespass it. Clearly, the bounds are set. But as a positive statement, it's like, well, how does this actually exist? The how is not described, right? They're not saying, because there was plenty of philosophy at hand and anthropology. They could have said, in the mind of the human, like through the reason, they could have tried to look at some center of connection or some how, but they actually very chastely, don't attempt that. This is nothing more than trying to defend this sort of very mysterious confession. Like, all we know is he's fully God and fully man. Just don't say otherwise. So it's beautiful, really, actually. The more I learn about this, the more it impresses me. So just like with Nicaea, we have a definition and then 50 years of squabbling after. Same kind of thing. So we have this definition, and there's a group that will not sign it and that breaks away, and they're the non-Chalcedonian churches, also called monophysites. They've kind of rebranded as Miaphysites. That is the church in Egypt. Do you remember when ISIS beheaded 21 people 3 years ago? You remember that, when the orange jumpsuits? They were members of the Egyptian church, which is the Coptic church. Yeah, the Coptic church are the strong living descendants of the non-Chalcedonian churches. There's another group too, but they're the main ones. So again, and talk about confusion language, the people that didn't like this statement, they weren't really against it, and so they were for it in so many ways. They just thought that it still kept too much of a division in Christ. And so there's these moderate non-Chalcedonians, and I'm going to skip this because it all gets kind of technical. The church in Ethiopia, the Tawahedo church, with those dug out from the ground cathedrals. You ever seen those? Incredible feats of architecture. They're monophysite as well. So there's like 200 years. I'm going to touch base on this again. The monophysite controversy continues in some quarters, in the East only, for another 200 years, and there's 2 more councils to hammer it out. Actually, I think I've got some. Actually, I'm going to come back to that. I got a couple more slides on that, so just let that be, and we'll come back. We'll come back to it in a bit. Changing gears entirely. Actually, before I do that, any questions on that part of the first part of the 5th century? Okay. Well, then we look at the fall of Rome. Or as all good history teachers will tell you, not so much the fall as the stumbling, subtle, slow demise. Because a fall sounds like there was one invasion and it was over. It was actually a whole sequence of invasions and a whole sequence of the decay of civil infrastructure. So there was this big sack in 410. That's considered sort of the big, that's the first big domino that you can kind of really mark as the fall of Rome. But then when the emperor lineage is broken by Odoacer, that sort of is the culmination of it. So we're looking, spanning the 5th century, which is what we're looking at. The sack by Alaric, I don't know how to pronounce that. Does anyone know how to pronounce Alaric? Alaric? Okay, we'll go with Alaric. You know who would know is Dr. Rodriguez. He would know how to pronounce that. I'll ask him. So the sack was very psychologically jarring. And not just for sort of people who love the empire, but remember the empire is a Christian empire at this point. Now, the formal seat of empire has been moved from Rome to which city? Constantinople, New Rome, right? So the emperor and his court are in Constantinople, but Old Rome is still a very significant sort of, it holds a lot of the cultural heritage of the empire. I think that there might be some analogy here between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., right? Like, Philadelphia is not the capital anymore, but like, if someone just tore down that hole where they made the Constitution and burned the Liberty Bell, it would still be like, oh man, you're like, the nation's really getting hit right now, even though it's not the functioning capital. So Old Rome functioned in that same way. But also remember, Rome has been a Christian empire legally for more than a century, but officially a Christian empire for 40 years at this point. 30 years. So when Rome gets attacked, it's not only a sense of, wow, the empire that we love is crumbling. There was a sense of, is Christianity being attacked? Right? Because when they're blurred, it's unclear who the attack is against, right? This is still part of our political landscape, right? The radical Muslims in the Middle East will say Christians are attacking us culturally over here, by which they mean Americans, right? I mean, like, the concepts are combined. So, so citizen struggle and Christian struggle. So this is a quote from Jerome, one of his letters. I won't read it all, but he's writing about Rome falling, Rome by the sack of Alaric. Who can set forth the carnage of that night? What tears are equal to its agony? These are verses from the Bible applied to, which were first written about the sack of Jerusalem by ancient Babylon. And he's reapplying it to Christian Rome. Very interesting move, but it reveals like how jarring this was for them. in the wake of the demise of Western Rome, what we see is the church in East and West really beginning. Because you have a church, think of a map of Europe, and your Dalmatian coast is sort of your north-south. So you have Italy, France, Germany, and all that on the west, and then you have Greece and Byzantium and the Levant on the east. Because they're living under different things. In Byzantium, they're still living under sort of the emperors into sort of an unattacked empire. Right? And here now you're living with these sort of strange Gothic tribes with a different language and different set of values who are doing different things differently. And Rome is sort of the old ideals that are going. So a cultural shift leads to the transition and is going to provoke, as we see, different problems. The church, East and West, continues to interact, but the problems are different. The church in the Western Empire is forced to adapt, no longer under the sort of aegis of a protecting empire. How's it going to survive? The church in the East actually has material security with the empire, what will come to be Byzantium, as we're going to see. So when there's the material security, they actually have, as it were, the luxury, for better or worse, to deal with all these finer points of theology. The monophysite problem will continue, will be the main troubling point until the rise of Islam in the 7th century. So I'm going to spend the next bit of time looking at these two different churches. We're going to look first at the East, and then we'll end our time today on the West. So in your minds, here we are now in the second half of the 5th century, moving towards the 7th century, that window of time in the East, so Greece and eastward, what we call Byzantium. What we have is, I want to just touch base with two things, the ongoing monophysite controversy, and then I want to just touch on, you could do a much more elaborate history, but on specifically Justinian, who's kind of a new Charlemagne or Theodosius in the East, his conquests and his settlements. So speaking of these two things by piece, so remember, this monophysite controversy continues. Those who were not on board were the ones who thought that the Chalcedons still sounded too much like Nestorius. And for all these years, there's all these attempts at reconciliation. Emperors, like Charlemagne had done at Nicaea, try and intervene with these ideas, and they say, maybe this language, this verbiage could be reconciliatory. And then someone would say, yeah, one side would say, yeah, the other side would say no, or they both say no, or more often they both said no. Dissatisfied on both sides in this case. And then sometimes that even leads to when someone says yes to it, it's like, well, if you said yes to that, well, then we're not in communion with you. You get some of our first excommunications between the Bishop of Rome and the East. So you see East-West, sort of these are little fractures on the vase. We get Rome excommunicating the Bishop of Constantinople because he agreed to this non-Chalcedonian statement. So that's 30 years. I mean, that's a substantial break of communion. So I'm going to use the language of Miaphysites. Greek for some reason, has 3 different words for the word one, right? Hen, monos, and mia. Monos means one only, and so mia means more just like one, and so the moderate non-Chalcedonians said, look, we're not just trying to say one only, we're not trying to overstate, but we do want to say one. So we see this language of Miaphysites. I'm going to skip these details, but you know how in English we have the adjective Byzantine, right? That comes chiefly from sort of architectural motifs that are incredibly elaborate, but the architecture reflected also the mindset of the culture. These theological arguments, when you read them, I love theology, and it starts to numb my mind. I mean, it's like these incredible, laborious arguments about prepositions and their received usages, and that's where we get the language of Byzantine. One of the things they tried to do was say, okay, fine, we'll grant you that Christ has 2 natures if you'll grant us that he has one will, just one will. And along comes a man named Maximus the Confessor, who I should really have a slide for, who actually takes the gospel, the simple gospel story of the Garden of Eden, and says, if there's only one will, from what is he speaking when he says, may this cup pass from me? Right? That's clearly a will interacting with another will that he then submits to. And so what gets hammered out is, nope, you can't say that he has one will either. Will, they hammer out, is a function of nature, of which Christ has 2. Therefore, he has 2 wills as well. So that kind of extending, so there's actually further ecumenical councils. there's a Fifth Ecumenical Council that gets called to address monothelitism. It's not monophysitism, but monothelitism of one will. Anyways, I'll come back to that. So there's all that theology. I want to talk briefly about Justinian. This is the era of his reign. In the mid-6th century, here's a mosaic from, I can't remember where, maybe Ravenna. No, I can't remember. Justinian, as far as emperors go, is kind of the boss. So the empire had shrunk geographically. He conquered back tons of land. He seemed to be a very astute diplomat. He really advocates for Chalcedonian Christology. His empire has been really troubled with that. His wife actually is a monophysite sympathizer. So, a bit of intrigue there. He builds a lot of churches. He calls the Fifth Ecumenical Council. Pretty impressive resume as far as emperors go. This is Hagia Sophia. Has anyone been to Hagia Sophia? Wow, cool. So you will know that the minarets are not original. Those are, I believe, a 13th or 14th century addition when it became a mosque for 800 years. So this central part it was the largest dome set on a square base ever in history. And when it was completed on its inauguration day, Justinian kind of stands proudly and says, "Solomon, I have outdone thee," referencing Solomon's building of the temple for the Jews in 900 BC. So a pretty cocky statement, but maybe justified because it is a pretty impressive building. So yes, that's Hagia Sophia. It's now a museum, and you can see traces of both its Christian and its Muslim worship history within it. So they've big icons that were gilded over. They've sort of uncovered. There's these big discs with Muslim prayers on, which are too big to be removed, and they've been left up. And so there's all this. It's very interesting hodgepodge of Turkish history. We have a Fifth Ecumenical Council, which continues to work out Chalcedonian things. It also condemns Origenism. Wait, Origenism? Didn't Origen die 300 years ago? He did. But some ideas which came under his name became really popular with 5th century monks, and they started to have all these do these theological writings, which got them in trouble. And one of you asked me a question about this a while back. Origenism in the 6th century, Origen himself was a cautious scholar, but the two errors that flew under his name were there was two ideas. One was that human souls had an existence before this life. And this actually, you can see how this connects kind of in a way to the Christological controversy, maybe. And the other was that on the last day of human history, all things will be reconciled to God. Demons, everything gets made right in the end, and there's no hell and no punishment, and everything will be happy. This doctrine gets called universalism, and that was what the councils were really against, as it just wasn't the received teaching. This has had a revival in the last 150 years. This is kind of a functioning theology for many, many people. But I don't know if it's comforting or discomforting, but it was officially condemned at an ecumenical council. So in sum, much of the life of the church, state, and controversy in the East is a continuation of what we saw in the years 350 to 450. So here I'm talking about the 450 to 600, just with different terms and people. So much of when you read this period of history, you're like, wait, haven't we been on this ground already? Right? These things just kind of drag on. I'm summing this up briefly because I've also studied Eastern church history a bit less, and I know less. So now we'll go to Western history, where I know a bit more, turning our attention to the West. Before I do that, any questions about Origenism, the division of the church in the East, Justinian? Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Justinian's wife was a Christian, but she was sympathetic to the monophysite cause. So she was a Christian. She went to church. So I wonder if you're thinking of Constantine and Helena, his mother. So the mother of Constantine was a Christian and may have had a role to play in Constantine's accepting of the faith. Perhaps, is that what? It might have been. Now, it may have also been true Justinian. I just don't know. I don't know his biography. So maybe you could find out and get back to us. Maybe. Now's a good time for a break. When we come back, we'll pick up with the Western church history for this 150-year period. We'll take an 8-minute break. If you don't need a break, feel free to come on up and chat if you'd like. All right. We'll gather back up. And we're going to look at the Western church. I want to begin with a little curiosity. Did you know the system of dating things by BC and AD was invented in this era in which we are looking, what we now very conveniently can refer to as the 6th century AD. Prior to that, everything was dated off of regnal years, like the years of a king, or in the case of the sort of classical world, off of the years since the founding of Rome. So if you look in ancient documents prior to the 6th century, they'll say in the 500 AUC, which is a Latin abbreviation for since the founding of the city of Rome. So everything was dated, and it was only sort of as the sort of Christian culture began to emerge under a legalized Christianity and authorized Christianity, that sort of deep rethinking of the very names for time sort of came to consciousness. So this guy named Dionysius Exiguus comes up with it. He does the math, and he kind of adds up like all the bishops and emperors that he knew about, and adds them all up, and then kind of finds Caesar Augustus, and then looks at the scripture and says, the 15th year of Tiberius, and he does all the math, and so he comes up with the year 0. Because if you think about it, our calling, the year that happened 2018 years ago, year 0, is essentially arbitrary, right? It's just time passing, numbers on a line, and it's just where you're going to put that 0. What's interesting is there is not a biblical scholar on this planet who thinks that Jesus was born in year, or there is no year 0, right? But there's not a biblical scholar on the planet who thinks that Jesus was born in year 1. They all think it was between 4 and 6 BC. So Dionysius was off by 4 to 6 years. So that small fact notwithstanding, it's still pretty cool and pretty awesome to think about reshaping time according to the most important event in the Christian paradigm, when heaven and earth met, right? It's interesting that it's not dated off of Easter, right? 0 is not set on Easter year. It's set on the year of Jesus being born, on the incarnation, right? Because that's what all this Christological controversy was about, right? The day when heaven and earth came together, when God and man were united in one thing, which happened in the womb of an ordinary woman in Palestine. So it's pretty cool to think about that time. I just learned that in the days of the week that we call them, they're named after the Norse gods mostly, right? Like Wednesday is Woden's day, and Thursday is Thor's day. It's like, these pagan time names run really deep. I learned in Irish, they got their names for the days after Christian evangelism. And so like their day for Wednesday is, if you translate the Irish, is the little fast. And their day for Thursday is the day between the fasts. And their day for Friday, if you translate it, is the fast day. Right? And it's like, because it's all off of the Christian ritual life. I would love to see us get rid of Woden's day, but there's some things that are sunk in too deep. Jews today date the years from the creation of the world, right? If you look in any Orthodox Jewish documentation, it'll say in the year 5,145, meaning since the world began, which is pretty awesome. I'd love to sign letters that way, but I saw a hand raised over here. Yeah.
What was Dionysius actually use? Obviously, he used Greek as we do in English.
Oh, yeah, okay, so he was writing in Latin. So it would have been like ante Christum or something. So, yeah. I'm just guessing at that, but whatever it translates as before Christ. Yeah, that's true. So AD is still Latin, right? Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, or the year of the Lord. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure what exactly he did use, and why don't we use the Latin? Who knows? I think he probably just was more concerned with AD, because he wasn't trying to do past history. He was just dating his present events. The first historian to pick up this terminology and use it was an Englishman, the Venerable Bede. Because they had no use for BC because they weren't writing about Old Testament history ever. In a chronological way. So, yeah, BC actually, just guessing here, I'm just guessing. It must have come in just since English usage. Otherwise, we'd have Latin acronym. So, okay, so the church in the West. I want to look at 3 things in 25 minutes. So after the fall of a Christian empire, the church needed to adapt. And there's 3 things I want to look at in terms of adaptation. One is the huge rise of monasticism. Second is how to adapt in the face of the rise of the so-called barbarians. Unfortunate name, because apparently most historians say they were fairly pastoral people. And then the third is the rise of the papacy, which is sort of the last gift of this era, which comes to shape medieval Europe and the rest of church history. So we're going to take these things in order. The rise of monasticism. I want to subtitle this section of slides, Creating a Culture and Curating a Culture. Monasticism had received several shapings. So remember, it began with just zealous dudes going out into a desert to do nothing but pray all day. But then there were church leaders, Pachomius, Basil, Augustine, we very briefly touched on those, who gave shape and structure to the lives of the monks, right? Both because they needed some order and also to curb some of the excesses and to actually start encouraging them towards the service of the church rather than radical, isolated devotion. So they'd had some shapings before, so this sort of random, unorganized grassroots movement had gotten some shaping, but its arch-shaper was Benedict of Nursia, right? St. Benedict. He created the ultimate synthesis of monastic ideals, like the life of zealous dedication to prayer and communal living and submission to the church. How do those things come together? Because if you think about it, they stand at first blush opposed, right? Like going off to be by yourself, the word monachos means alone, and yet in community. We're going to come back to that in a second. Here's a brief bio of Benedict. He quit his home. He goes and meets a monk who's a part of a sort of a less formed, less shaped order. He's a hermit. And then Benedict himself lives as a hermit and was invited to actually lead this small monastic gathering of people. I believe up until that point they were under Augustine's instructions for monks. He wrote this book called The Rule of the Master, and he enforced it over his monks, and within 2 years they tried to poison him. The problem with The Rule of the Master, we have fragments of it, is that it was too severe. It had unrealistic expectations of normal human beings for a life of Christian service. So Benedict learned. He actually was a good pastor, and he realized, wow, I've missed the mark. I've actually not encouraged my people to intense godliness. I've discouraged them, and that's why they want to kill me. So he has a second take. He goes to Monte Cassino, and he writes the most defining work for the Middle Ages. Those of you, I just learned about, is it Dr. Kicklighter teaches in middle class? I'd be curious what a medievalist, I think he'd agree with this, but I think that you could ask him about this statement. Would he say the Rule of Benedict was the most defining work? I'd be curious if he has what he would say might be a stronger contender. The Rule of St. Benedict, it's not a long book. If you get it, it's like 60 pages. It's not all that long, easy reading. Written sometime around 529. It utilizes a book called The Conferences by John Cassian. This guy, John Cassian, goes out into the Egyptian desert and he interviews all these old monks about what things they found most useful in their life as a monk. So in Benedict, even though he's here in the West, right, Benedict is in northern Italy, he's relying for wisdom on a book which was a transcription of monastic life in the deserts of Egypt. So there's this organic link between Western monasticism and its eastern roots in the Egyptian desert. And one of the sort of geniuses of Benedict's rule, from I'm trying to kind of a wordplay here, right? From monos, meaning alone, to monastery, which is essentially communal. One of the strokes of genius which the old monks figured out in Egypt is, and I think I touched on this in a lecture before, but if you want to renounce everything, you think, well, I'll just get away from everybody. But then you're still living for yourself. And actually, if you want total self-renunciation, you actually have to live in community because it's only other people who are going to demand things of you that you don't want to do, right? And so what's genius is actually, if you want to be refined into a life of self-denial and prayer and humility, live with other people. That was the vision of the monastery. And anyone who's lived in a dorm or had roommates or is married, right? No, I have a friend who was a monk for 18 years. For a number of reasons, he ended up leaving the monastery. He was a Benedictine. He got married. As of this day, he's been married for 18 years. And so I asked him when that time was actually now it's 19 years. I asked him, I said, which is required more self-denial and taking up of the cross and just a life of serving others. The monastery or marriage? He said, the marriage, no question. So I take great encouragement from that as a married man, that like just because we're not all called to be monks doesn't mean can't be called to a school just as rigorous. So community is that ultimate synthesis. I want to just touch on, there's so many gems in the rule of St. Benedict. In his prologue, he calls the monastery a school for the Lord's service. And it was for laity. I think we often think of monks as priests. That was a medieval invention. Monks were chiefly lay people. Benedict is really interested in the idea of peace. This is the Latin word for peace, pax. Like finding peace of heart, peace in the community, peace with nature, like peace at all levels. He's big on two things, work and prayer. Ora et labora. That's a Benedictine motto to this day. What two things does a monk need to do? He needs to pray, and he needs to work. And monks take 3 vows. People often think of monastic vows as poverty, chastity. I forget what they think the third one is. Charity, yeah. But actually, those are Franciscan vows, also popular in the Middle Ages. But the Benedictine vows are very interesting. You have to take a vow of stability. Isn't that interesting? That you're going to stay in one place as long as you're able. You're actually going to commit to being with these particular brothers. You take a vow of obedience to the abbot, that if he says jump, as long as it's not against God, you jump. And continual conversion of life, that every day you will try and be more and more converted. Those are the 3 vows of Benedict, which are such interesting vows. I have a friend who was at a revival, like a Pentecostal-style revival conference a couple years ago, and there were these Benedictine nuns there. And the preacher, on the open is like a 4-day thing. On the first night it says, who of you wants to give your life to Christ? And these 4 nuns just jump out of their seats. And I say, yes. And everyone interprets it as, wow, these nuns like didn't even know true religion, and now they've just become Christians. This is great, right? But then the second night, the preacher does the same call and says, who wants to give their life to Christ tonight? And the nuns stand up again. And they're like, oh, okay, well, great. All 4 nights, he said. He was an eyewitness. He saw them stand up all 4 nights. Because they cultivated an attitude of heart that says, I need to be continually converted. I don't want a one-time conversion. I want an every minute conversion. So I love that story, those dear nuns. But that really embodies the Benedictine spirit. Along the way, Benedict gives shape to monasticism that still exists to this day. A prayer schedule, the 7 hours of prayer, every 3 hours through the day. A schedule of reading the Psalms, and really hammering out the role of the abbot. It's actually, some political scientists see seeds of later governmental development in some of the rules about an abbot, like sort of a limiting of powers. To say, look, this is what a good abbot can do, and this is what an abbot should not do. And if it does this, this is what the community does. Right? Actually placing him in an accountable relationship with the community he serves. So huge things there. These are the hours of prayer, just so you can see the names. And they're called an hour of prayer, but each service lasts about 10-15 minutes. If you want to see this, 2 hours away from here in Conyers, Georgia, there's a monastery called the Monastery of the Holy Spirit. There are Trappists out over there, which are, they're the most earnest of the Benedictines. And they do this, and you can go pray with them. They have an open nave. The monks will come in, and I've done it. You can pray Matins, Lords, Prime, at 3 a.m. The first prayer office is at 3 a.m. And you can see this life continues to this day, and it was hammered out by Benedict in the 6th century. The monks were crazy about the Psalms, song is about that, and the abbot. More gems from the rule. I'm going to have to skip this, but these are just things. Oh, I love this. He says, never give a cold greeting of peace. Right? I don't know if any of you go to churches and you shake the hand of the people around you. Benedict says, never give a cold greeting of peace. People think monks take a vow of silence. They didn't. There are monks that take a vow of silence. Carthusians, they're called. Benedict called not for silence, but for taciturnitatis, which is actually, we get the word taciturn, reticence to speak. Right? Quietness is a better translation. So the other thing is monks, as well as their prayers, their subsistence farming, their curating of nature, their copying of the scriptures. When the institutions of civil life became unfunded and abandoned in the face of the barbarian invasions, libraries, academies, guilds. The only people left who were sort of curating documents were the monks. So, and one monk in particular, a guy named Cassiodorus, contemporary of Benedict, he was the one who sort of saw like, wow, a monk has a more expansive mind to investigate the things of God if he's also got a classical training. So he thought it was valuable to preserve, to preserve, as well as the scriptures and patristic writings, classical texts. And they're 90% of everything we have from the classical world has come down only because of the work of the monks. Did you know that? All of our manuscript copies in Latin, of all the Latin and Greek works, are from the monks, and Greek. Some was preserved in Arabic, but those are sort of secondary translations and only referential. Like all the core stuff, the Loeb Library was first hand-penned by monks. So these are some examples of different manuscripts. This is Hebrew. No, that's not. That's Greek. This is a Greek manuscript. I don't know what of. I just think I Google searched Greek manuscript. This looks 5th century. I have no idea when this is. It's probably old, actually. Probably 4th century. It's probably around the time of St. Benedict. So here's a medieval drawing of a scriptorium. This would have been later than the time of Benedict, but encapsulates the idea. This is the master of the scriptorium who would often be reading aloud from a document, and then the documents would then be copied orally, because then you see the labor-saving thing? If you're copying visually, you can get one book from one book. If you've got one guy reading and 5 copyists, you can get 5 copies at the rate of 1, right? Which is also why we get homological spelling errors in manuscripts, because they thought they heard the word there, if it was in English, T-H-E-R-E, but the word was there, T-H-E-I-R. And so you get spelling mistakes like that in different Greek manuscripts of both the Bible and classical manuscripts. So scriptoria, the vast majority of ancient texts. And just to think about letter by hand. I mean, it's really a miracle. The Benedictine rule spreads, and monasteries are founded throughout Europe. Europe becomes Benedictine. I mean, in France, Germany, England, to this day, the monastic foundations are so many. So just to keep sort of a bit of history, later history is Cistercians, are 12th century reformers of Benedictines. Trappists are reformers of Cistercians, but these are all Benedictines. Monasteries formed the first hostels for pilgrims, but pilgrims were often sick because they're traveling in bad weather. So a hostel, in fact, if you know French, it's like the same word, right? Hotel, no, it's not the same word in French, but the roots are similar. I need to learn French more. But anyways, there's this idea of taking care of sick people and travelers. It was monks who came up with that idea. And then the idea that education was valuable for all people and educating children. Schools begin in monasteries. All of the first universities in, I don't know how to pronounce the city, but Bologna, I don't know how you pronounce that. How do you pronounce that city? Bologna. Bologna, they claim to be the first university ever. Oxford, Paris, they all founded their universities in the 12th and 13th century in monasteries, because it was monasteries who cared for education. So monasticism is the biggest part. I want to say something briefly about barbarians. When Christian Rome falls, you get these groups of people come in, and there's a whole bunch of them, right? Visigoths and Ostrogoths and Lombards and Merovingians and Carolingians and, oh no, they're different. But anyways, Vandals, they bring with them their native religions, some of which were pagan. Some of them were Arians. There was this one ultra-zealous Arian missionary named Ulfilas or Wulfilas, who converted a bunch of the Germanic tribes to an extreme Arianism. So it was substantially different than Christianity, and that's why, in a way, we see writers in Western Europe still talking about Arianism long after it's died as an issue of the empire. It's actually the anti-Arian neighbors that add the word and the son to the creed. That's where that came from. I'll skip over that real quick because in the interest of time. But that is what causes the division between East and West, was in fighting the Arians. They add that phrase, and that the East doesn't like that. The Catholic faith in Western Europe waxes and wanes intermittently. We don't see, what I mean is it's sort of, when we look at the geography and the leaders, like some local kings take an interest and then they don't, and then some other king conquers and he does and doesn't. And you kind of see, when you read Bede's ecclesiastical history, it's like, and this, what we would call a county, this county is a Christian and now it's not. And then this county is a Christian and now it's not. And then they're both Christian and now they're not. And it's just this in fits and starts. And so you see a lot of missionary work hither and thither. So this is the era of St. Patrick, right? The famous missionary to Ireland. This is him legendarily driving out the snakes. Zoologists say there were never snakes in Ireland, which when I heard that I was like, oh. But then I thought, well, what did St. Patrick do that made them tell that story? What did he drive out? You know, I think it's an interesting way to think about hagiography. Clovis is a king of the Franks, and he's one who very powerfully asserts the Catholic faith as opposed to the Arian faith across the 6th century, in the early 6th century. And he's considered kind of one of the first real Christian kings who sort of establishes a Christianity after the Roman Empire had established it. St. Columba in Irish, Colmcille, in an era when the faith waned in Germany and Holland and northern France, it was the Irish who brought it back, right? So St. Patrick and the gospel had gone up to Ireland, it waned over here, and Ireland sent it back. So there are still Irish-founded monasteries in Germany to this day. So you heard of the Book of Kells? That was sort of the era of St. Columba. Articulating the faith in these new missionary contexts produces for the church more useful definitions of faith. I think we touched on this briefly with the Trinity, but what's called the Athanasian Creed gives us the most expansive creed we have in terms of defining the Trinity. And this was done as a missionary tool to be really clear, like, this is what we're trying to teach. We say this once a year in our church, and it's a mouthful. It's like 3 pages. You do it too? Nice. It's a mouthful, but it's a good mouthful, because everything, you're just affirming 3 and denying 3 different, and you're affirming 1 and denying the collapse. I mean, you're just affirming and denying, and at the end you're like, okay, I still don't really know more. I'm just confessing truthfully the mystery of faith. We get what's called the Vincentian canon that comes out of this era. This is this idea of, again, further developing of this idea we've looked at in several lectures on the rule of faith. And when we look at, by this point, they're able to see, wow, we're using a more precise vocabulary than they did in the 1st century, but we're professing the same faith. Huh, what about that? So this guy, St. Vincent, kind of comes up with an idea that's been governing to the church ever since, which is that, well, in the same way a human body can grow up, and you would still say it's the same person in the same body, like I'm the same person I was when I was 10, but I'm bigger now. My little daughter, I have a 3-year-old, she says, I'm bigger, I'm bigger. He said, that's like how it is with doctrine. Like, we are saying things in a more detailed way, but it is the same body. And that's sort of how that tension is held together. And what he appeals to is when they were encountering, every age has encountered its own novelties. One of the things he said is a useful test for discerning what has been handed down is, well, what's been believed, quod ubique, quod semper, quod ab omnibus, at all times, in all places, by all people, right? What's been handed down? Like, they're again appealing to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. That's what we do in all the churches, right? So appealing like, well, that may be what you guys do in Germany, but that's not what everybody else has done. So it's suspect, like appealing to a common core, if I may renew a phrase. Yeah.
Excuse me, but as we've been looking at heresy and otherwise,
Yeah.
even into 1700,
Yeah.
the 39 articles, 37 articles, those, what is at stake for doctrine? And what defines heresy is the nature and person of Christ, or the nature and person of God.
Yeah.
At what point does it begin? Because what I've seen in the last 150 years, which is the Puritan movement in its variety,
Yeah.
is now heresy is defined by what you or I do. Not what we believe about God, but what you or I do.
Yeah, so when people today point to someone's actions and say, heretic, they're just using the word wrongly out of ignorance, I think. Because certainly I think the church has pretty consistent moral call to say these are things you should do if you obey Jesus, and these are things you should not do. But to disobey those moral commands is not to be a heretic, it's just to be disobedient, right? So you're right, heresy, properly defined, is always about doctrine. And it is a shame that that word gets thrown around, especially when the early church was actually never zealous to throw that word around. It was a heartbreaking thing to have to say, like, even these councils, like, there's a sense in which it's like, that's heresy. It wasn't like, heretic, heretic, heretic. You know, I hear you. These days it's kind of this, we're doing this sort of a thing. And that spirit is different than the spirit of the early church. So I want to affirm that. Am I roughly hitting on what you're saying, or did I miss it? Okay. So that's the rise of sort of missionary activity in the face of barbarian Europe. The third and final thing I want to look at is the rise of the papacy. And the subtitle for this section of slides is stepping into a void means stepping into a power. Stepping into power. So there's bishops in every major city throughout the world in the early church, right? There's a bishop of Constantinople, a bishop of Jerusalem. There still are bishops in those cities. And there's a bishop of Rome. Every large city has its sort of senior pastor over the churches in that city. There were at times, from very early on, sometimes struggles between bishops in different cities. So Alexandria and Antioch, right? Rome and, who did Rome struggle with? I'm trying to think of a historical example. Rome, and there was a church in North Africa. Carthage. In Rome and Carthage had some struggles early on with Novatian. That's right. So the bishops had often struggled against each other, and there had often been this sometimes sort of fraternal conflict and so even trying to shape and push each other a little bit. So there had been conflict, certainly. And from the beginning, Rome was honored as a city of a special dignity. It was recognized from the earliest days to be the site of the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, the two greatest apostles. So it was like, of all cities, like, Rome is great. And then, of course, tie that in with a bit of natural patriotism, right? Because it's Rome, it's the city of Rome. Those things kind of comboed. There was just a love for the city of Rome. And the bishop of Rome, as descending from Peter, of course, the bishop of Antioch also has his descent from Peter, because Peter was first bishop in Antioch, it says in the book of Acts. The bishop of Rome was considered the first among equals, meaning of all the bishops, there's one who we would give a special kind of badge of honor. He's the primus inter pares, he's the bishop of Rome. So that's true for the first 350 years of the church, for the first 300 years of the church. And then you get this seismic political shift, right? The Western Roman Empire crumbles, the infrastructure, the leadership positions get attacked and abandoned. And when the Gothic people invade, they took stuff, and as often happens with invasions, the concern for the sort of natives on the ground was minimal, right? The Goths didn't come in and be like, oh, you had an elaborate welfare system? Well, let us fund that for you, right? I mean, they just let the northern Italians kind of fend for themselves. So they didn't trouble with the locals, and so there's this leadership vacuum, right? The local, like, a city has needs, right? Health, I mean, just public health and sanitation needs primarily, and food and water supply, basic sort of living stuff, wasn't getting attended to. So there was plague after plague in Rome after 410. Things were pretty ugly and rough. I'm going to go really fast through this. So, okay, I got 1 minute. Basically, the bishops step into that power vacuum, and they start acting as sort of de facto mayors. And then the people, because they have good hearts and are fatherly figures, people are actually appreciative of this. And so they're preaching on Sunday and distributing the water and taking care of the sewage on Monday, right? So they become the de facto leaders. When Attila the Hun threatens to attack Lombardy, it's Pope Leo who goes up as the diplomat and talks him out of it. A bishop who now has talked away a great invading leader and who himself then is a great leader. So there becomes this sort of rise of power. The word pope just means papa, means it was applied to a lot of bishops. And then successive popes, one after another, sort of inflate the sense of, I'm the mayor, I'm the governor, I'm the bishop, I'm the pope. And so then what we get is culminates, really, the historians call Pope Leo the first pope, so-called, because he's the first one to sort of claim authority over other bishops that was never recognized to him to begin with. Gregory the Great really catalyzes that, He was truly a great man. He does all these great things. He's a model pastor. He's a great organizer. He does everything well. And in so doing, actually brings under his aegis all moral and civil authority for Western Europe. He sends missionaries to England. I mean, he's just got his view of everything sort of west of Italy and west. So you can see, it's actually in this first 600 years, this is the seed. Now, Gregory the Great was a great man. You know, fast forward 300, 400 years, 500 years, and you get the Medicis around in Italy, and you get these horrible men who inhabit that same amount of authority, and you can see how things tumble along to the Reformation. So what begins as a mere accident of history, a political vacuum, gives authority to a bishop who then actually starts to claim too much for himself. And now the popes these days are much more humble than the popes of the Middle Ages, but it's in the Middle Ages where they wielded a power that was unbearable to the people, hence the Reformation. So anyway, so I want to say the interesting thing of this study is how it plants the seeds for the Middle Ages. Lastly, and this is my last slide, just look how far we've come in 7 weeks, right? 12 fishermen, well, they weren't all fishermen, but 12 uneducated Jewish men in a backwater city, as far as Rome is concerned, in the Levant, in just 6 centuries has become a world-dominating movement. It's outlived an empire in one half and fully consumed an empire on the other half of the side of things. Theological disputes that would just blow the socks off of, like, dear St. John, who keeps telling us to love each other. You know, I mean, the scriptures are complex, but these complexities, you know, all these different things, all the conflicts and the heresies and the schisms and how much has been contested for and won. And what I want to say is, look how much has been preserved, too. That even though the church looks so different in the year 600 than it does in the year 34, there's a continuity to what was believed, and a continuity even to the very structure of the church, even as it's enlarged in so many ways. So I hope that, having seen 7 weeks of church history, you have a good sense of that continuity and what was fought for and handed down, even as things developed along the way. So yes, that's another. Thank you for coming to this Holy class. You're very kind. And I'll continue to be available by email. Don't forget, no lecture next week. But if you have any questions or things by email, I'd love to engage about any of these things. And the slides will remain up in perpetuity.